Okay, first of all, good afternoon, and I want to thank Ming Hui for inviting me here. So glad to be giving a talk. So also thanks Zhong Liang for giving a very nice overview of land surface modeling. So for me, I have an easier job, so I'm just going to focus a little bit more on just a smaller topic that we have been working on with our colleagues, including the names over here. So what I'm going to talk about is how do we represent human influences on the terrestrial water cycle, and focusing on representing them in Earth system models. So some of the overarching science questions that we are trying to answer are listed over here. So first of all, I mean, a lot of us, when we do Earth system modeling, we mostly worry about the models aren't giving us good precipitation and things like that. And obviously, precipitation is important because, I mean, this is really the important water supply for human beings and for the ecosystems and things like that. But as a matter of fact, we don't really use precipitation directly, right? I mean, we use water that is being captured in the rivers, and then in the rivers, then we also have like reservoirs and things like that, and we have dams that do the impoundment and then regulate the water in the reservoirs. And so these are the water that we actually use. So what is important for us is not only to look at precipitation simulated by the model, but also be able to represent like the water in the streams, as well as the impacts of the reservoirs. And so some of the questions we asked are listed over here. So we wanted to know what are the dominant pathways for how human system and Earth system interact and therefore influence the water cycle. And one obvious pathway of how human and Earth system interact is obviously that by emitting greenhouse gases and things like that, you are going to change the radiative forcing. And by changing the radiative forcing, you will be changing the temperature, changing the large-scale circulation, etc. That would obviously change the water cycle. But what I'm more interested in right now in this particular problem is not necessarily through the changes in the greenhouse gases and the radiative forcing, but more related to these kind of direct human impacts, such as having reservoirs and dams and doing irrigation and things like that, and the direct impacts on the water cycle. And another question we'd like to answer is how will water cycle change, first of all, as a result of climate change? But then as a result of climate change, there are often policies that the society would make in order to mitigate or adapt to the climate change. So then the question is, okay, so if we are going to mitigate and adapt to climate change, will the impacts of these mitigation and adaptation actually create larger changes in the water cycle compared to the effects of climate change itself? So we like to compare these kind of effects. And then lastly, we also wanted to know what are the vulnerabilities of energy, water, and food to changes in climate, not only in the climate mean and the variability, but also to climate extreme. So later on, I'm going to show some examples of looking at, for example, one specific case of 2012 drought in the US, and whether our models are able to simulate that. And we also address this particular question of how climate change versus climate change mitigation would have an impact on water deficits in the future. So just a very quick overview of the processes that we're talking about. So Zhong Liang already gave you a very nice overview of a lot of processes, important processes in the land surface. And what we are focusing on, at least in this particular talk, is looking at soil moisture and runoff. And obviously, by changing soil moisture through climate change or whatever effects that you're looking at, changing soil moisture would affect surface fluxes, which then could also potentially impact cloud and precipitation. And so this is essentially linking the land surface processes to the atmospheric processes, or the so-called land-atmosphere interactions. In this particular presentation, I'm not going to talk about these land-atmosphere interactions, although we have been recently doing quite a bit of work using high-resolution model down to like convection permitting kind of simulations, and looking at land land-atmosphere interactions. And what we found is that very often when you go down to convection permitting simulation, you would actually get a very different land-atmosphere interaction or the feedback compared to when you are doing simulation depending on convective parameterizations. And most of the time in a simulation where you require the use of convection parameterization, you will be getting kind of like a positive feedback in land-atmosphere interaction, like the moisture, the soil, and then you will get more precipitation. But in a convection permitting simulation, actually what you get is very often just the opposite, is actually a negative feedback. And there have been some studies also indicated similar phenomena. So we have been working on that, although I'm not going to talk about this in this particular talk. But more importantly, I'm going to talk about here. So by changing soil moisture, you would also change like runoff, which goes into the river. So we have stream flow. And then we have these reservoirs and dams that do the management of the water. And as a result, you have regulated flow. And the regulated flow is actually what links to a lot of human activities like energy production, crop, transportation, flood control, domestic supply, etc. So I'm mostly going to focus on these type of processes in this particular talk. So I'm going to talk about how we model runoff generation and irrigation in the community land model. And Jung Liang already introduced this community land model, CLM. And I will also talk about modeling stream flow using a new river transport model that we developed called Mozart. And then also how do we represent water management within CLM by introducing a water management model. And then I will introduce a particular drought case where we used to do model evaluation. And then particularly using our models to look at how water deficits or water scarcity, some would call it, may change in the future. And then at the end, I will talk a little bit about ongoing and future work. So now let's take a look at the community land model and how do we represent soil hydrology. And this is again also one figure that Jung Liang also showed, the CLM, how does it represent the hydrology by looking at the interception by the canopies, and then the through flow would reach the soil, and then you would have surface runoff, subsurface runoff, etc., etc. So recently what we have done is to replace the parameterization for the surface and the subsurface runoff with a very popular model called the VIC model. It's called the Variable Infiltration Capacity Model, where they represent surface and subsurface runoff using these parameterizations. And so we have coupled that together with CLM and then compare the simulation using the original CLM versus using the CLM with this set of parameterizations. And so this is one particular result looking at observation at the top, and then the two simulation based on original CLM and CLM with the VIC parameterization over here. And we are particularly looking at a variable called the base flow index. The base flow index essentially is just the ratio of surface runoff to the total runoff, which is the sum of the surface and the subsurface runoff. So it tells you like how much water actually runs off at the surface versus altogether. And it's a very important parameter because this parameter actually has a lot of impacts on soil moisture itself. And based on an observation data set, we see that a lot of areas actually has a base flow index of pretty high value of the order of between like 0.6 to about 0.9. And with the original CLM4, you can see that mostly the values are really, really low, and they are of the order of like between 0.1 and 0.3 or 0.4, much lower than the observation. Whereas after we change the surface and the subsurface runoff parameterization using VIC, we were able to reproduce the observed base flow index quite well, although in some cases, in some locations, perhaps our values are a little bit too high. We have also kind of tested the CLM model in two different configurations. One is applying the land surface model. Typically, what people do most of the time is to just divide your area into rectangular grids like this. But we have also tested configuring our models using watershed boundaries instead of rectangular grids. And what we found is that if we apply the model this way without changing any parameterizations, this way would allow us to much reduce the sensitivity of your model simulation to the resolution. So essentially, simply by changing the way you represent the land surface, taking advantage of the topography and things like that, we can increase the model scalability, or in other words, reduce the sensitivity of the simulations to model resolution. So now we can configure CLM using both ways. Yeah. Another thing we introduced to the model is by looking at irrigation. So this figure here, based on observation, show the fraction area with irrigation worldwide. And we can see that worldwide there are lots of places, including the US and Asia, where growing crops actually rely a lot on irrigation. Even though in some area there's already quite a bit of precipitation, but they still rely on irrigation quite a bit. And this figure here shows the fraction of irrigated area that actually rely on groundwater rather than surface water. So do you irrigate the crop using water from the stream, or actually by pumping from the groundwater to irrigate the crop? And we find that in some areas, such as the central US, this is the Ogallala Aquifer, there's a lot of groundwater pumping going on in order to supply for the irrigation water. But also in Asia, particularly in India, they really rely almost like 85% of the irrigation water actually comes from groundwater pumping. And in fact, you can see a very significant signal of groundwater table change coming from the GRACE data. Even in the recent decades, you can clearly see there's significant reduction or lowering of the groundwater table because of this particular process. And so we have recently represented this groundwater pumping in CLM. So what we do is we can have a mechanism to actually directly draw water from the aquifer to do the irrigation, or we can draw the water coming from the runoff and use that as surface water to do the irrigation. And so the next slide, here we show some results when we were looking at whether groundwater pumping for irrigation is actually sustainable or not. And here we performed two experiments. In one experiment, we assume that all of the irrigation water has to come from surface water. And then in another experiment, we allow groundwater pumping according to the fractional area that is actually based on observation data. And we looked at the US, particularly 4 different regions where groundwater pumping is actually quite important source of irrigation water. And what we found looking at the 4 regions is that the red line shows the lowering of the groundwater table as soon as we started pumping groundwater to do the irrigation. The only area that actually doesn't show a long-term decline in the groundwater table is the lower Mississippi River. So apparently in this particular region, because of the particular soil type, etc., even with the groundwater pumping to do the irrigation, as soon as you apply the water back to the crops, the infiltration rate is so high that actually it doesn't affect the long-term groundwater table. And so apparently in this region, it is actually quite sustainable. But in all 3 other regions that we look at where there is large-scale groundwater pumping, it's actually not sustainable, so meaning that the groundwater table is really continuing to lower as a result of that. So besides doing the runoff and the irrigation, we have also recently developed a new model called the Model for Scale Adaptive River Transport. So it is really important for us when we look at like how water supply changes in the future climate and things like that, to be able to simulate the amount of water that is actually in the stream, because that's the kind of water that we can use. So if you look at a real river network, looking at this particular watershed, so runoff generation is a very fine-scale process that is not explicitly resolved. And so when runoff is generated, it usually goes along the hill slope and then get routed into a tributary. And then from the tributary, it will go to a main river channel. So this is what is in the real world. But in order to represent this kind of processes in a model that may not be able to fully resolve the tributaries or the hill slope runoff processes, we conceptualize the river network according to this. So we have this so-called subgrid hill slope routing of the runoff generation to a subnetwork routing, which is basically summing up all of these tributaries together into a subgrid network. And then within the model grid cell, then we have a main channel that corresponds to this main channel. And so using this conceptualized river network, we use the kinematic wave to solve the equations, and we are able to simulate the river transport in the rivers, and dynamically simulate the velocity of the river flow, etc., etc. And so this is just one example showing a global simulation of the river flow in the river based on our models. And we have also looked at, for example, compare our simulation with a more commonly used model called RTM, which is the original river transport model implemented in CLM. And we gradually kind of reduce the complexity of our model back to the form of an RTM, which essentially has a prescribed constant river velocity compared to Mozart, which dynamically simulates the water flow velocity. And we found that by gradually changing our model back to a simple model, such as RTM, you can actually create a factor of 5 difference in terms of the annual maximum flood amount, suggesting that it is really important for us to be able to dynamically simulate the river transport compared to like a model such as RTM, where you prescribe a constant river velocity. But we also find that the model generally kind of like over-simulate a lot of things. For example, if you look at here, the observed stream flow amount is shown in the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the simulated river flow amount. So mostly the model is overestimating the flow compared to observation. But what we found is actually mostly because of the fact that almost 90% of the rivers in the world are actually regulated. So when you have precipitation and the precipitation goes into the river, they don't actually just go to the ocean. And most of them are actually diverted and then used somewhere because of irrigation or domestic water supply, etc. So this so this factor is really because of human activities. By having a reservoir and dam, you would actually greatly reduce the stream flow that goes to the river. So in order to represent this kind of effect, so we have also introduced a model called the water management model that actually represent the effects of regulation by reservoirs. And so, for example, if you look at a reservoir over here, reservoirs are actually managed for many different purposes, but mostly around the world, there are 2 main purposes of regulating the flow. One is for flood control, right? Because sometimes you may have like a large amount of precipitation and you don't want it to flood the area. And so you use the reservoir to actually as a mechanism of controlling flood. And the second one is to use it for irrigation. A lot of places, your precipitation may come in the wintertime, but you actually mostly need the water in the summertime. And so the mismatch of the timing of precipitation and the stream flow that you need, we actually manage it by regulating the reservoir, right? So in a sense, we created a model that represents this kind of mechanism to control flood as well as irrigation. For example, for irrigation, we would like to release the water mostly during summertime when the crop is actually being grown. So we developed this kind of rules to regulate the stream flow. And so this is one example when we tested the model over the Columbia River Basin in the Pacific Northwest, as well as over the whole U.S., where we accounted for like over 1,800 different reservoirs in the U.S. for different purposes. And what I'd like to show here is that by accounting for both irrigation and flood control, and we compare our model simulated reservoir levels with the observed reservoir level. And we find that only when we combine the 2 rules together, we can simulate this timing of the reservoir level, because during wintertime, you would like to draw down the reservoir in the Pacific Northwest because most of our precipitation comes during wintertime, so flooding occurs mostly in the winter. So in order to prevent flood, you would like to draw down the reservoir in order to create the volume that can, in case if there is a big amount of precipitation, but then you would release the water for the summer for irrigation. So by capturing both of these effects, we were able to capture the timing of the reservoir levels quite well. And we have also been working with some of our colleagues at the Joint Institute of Global Change, where they have developed this global change assessment model called GCAM. So the GCAM model is the one that is actually being used to develop the RCP 4.5 scenario. So in these kind of models, they represent a lot of different human processes, including the energy economics, energy technology, agriculture. But recently, they have also added a module in the GCAM model to represent water demand. And the water demands are driven by many different processes, such as like domestic, it depends on population, it depends on the energy technology, it depends on crops, et cetera, et cetera. So these essentially provide us with information about water demand that is important for our study. So in order to test whether our model is able to do a good job or not, so we selected a particular case study, which we did actually publish a paper back in earlier this year with Marty Hurling and a number of us, including myself. So we were looking at this particular 2012 drought case in the Midwest. It's a pretty big drought case if you look at a particular year. So if you start from almost like the pre-industrial time to now, including even the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, in fact, if you look at the individual year in terms of the precipitation deficit, 2012 is the biggest. It's even larger than the Dust Bowl in terms of any single year, although the Dust Bowl actually lasts multiple years. So in terms of drought effect, the Dust Bowl is definitely a much bigger drought compared to this. But for a single year, the precipitation deficit is really huge. And usually during a drought year, you would also have increase in temperature, right? So you can also see a warmer temperature over here. So we selected the 2012 case for the drought year compared to 2009, which is almost kind of like a regular, typical year. And we wanted to see whether our model is able to capture the difference between 2012 and 2009. And so this is based on observation, showing that during 2012, in the summertime, precipitation is really a very large deficit. And that also caused a large deficit in terms of runoff and soil moisture. And then the temperature is a significant warmer compared to the climatology. And as a result of that, this is a satellite picture of the Mississippi River. You can see large areas of the Mississippi River with really no flow at all during the summertime. And then the crop yield, the corn yield recorded by USDA. This is for 2012 compared to all these years, which has been linearly increasing over the years. And 2012 actually is almost like a 26% drop in corn yield because of that. And because there was very little water flowing in the Mississippi River, and a lot of power plants, like nuclear power plants, they really require water to draw in to cool down the energy production. And because of the low flow, a lot of the power plants actually had to close down because of that. So we were trying to see whether our models are able to capture this particular 2012 event. So this is a simulation by the Wolf model coupled to CLM. And so we looked at the observed temperature anomaly, which is a warm anomaly. This is observed warm anomaly and the simulated anomaly. And then also in terms of precipitation, and the model was also able to capture the precipitation anomaly quite well. So when we look at whether the model is able to capture the change in the regulated flow between the 2 years, so here the kind of bluish colors correspond to 2009, which is almost like a regular year, and 2012 is a very dry year. And the red line and the black line is based on observation. So generally, the model is able to capture the difference between 2012 and 2009, although generally the model seems to overpredict the regulated flow amount. So over these two particular areas, which is in the Missouri and Upper Mississippi, overall, there is less precipitation and less snowmelt in 2012 compared to 2009. But when you look at the lower Mississippi, the Ohio River and the Tennessee, the 2012 year is actually a very strange year, not only because there is less precipitation in the summertime, but actually even during springtime, the temperature was much warmer, causing a lot of snowmelt much earlier than the regular year 2009. So that seems to actually contribute partly to the drought condition during the summertime. And generally, the model was able, as I said, to capture these difference between the 2 years quite well. And then when we look at the simulated flow reduction and the water deficit, so this is the flow simulated for 2009. And this is the change as the ratio of the flow in 2012 compared to 2009. So these kind of like brownish color show significant reduction. The ratio is significantly less than 1 because of the drought condition. And here we show the water deficits in 2009 and then 2012 compared to 2009, showing again a large increase in the water deficit during that year. So having kind of showed that our model was able to capture some of these effects, climatic effects on the regulated flow, then we next ask the question, like under climate change, where we expect warmer temperature may be causing more evapotranspiration and therefore less water supply. We wanted to compare two different scenarios. So RCP 8.5 is a no mitigation scenario compared to 4.5 where we apply climate change mitigation, which supposedly reduce the warming signal. And so we would think that by reducing the warming signal, it should help with the water supply. So would that overall help us in terms of the water deficit into the future? So this is essentially the question that we're trying to ask. So we designed a numerical experiment where we use CESM and then the regional model, which is the WRF CLM applied at 20-kilometer resolution over the US. And then we use these offline simulations of CLM together with the river transport model and the water management model, and then use GCAM to provide us with changes in the water demand. So essentially, we are comparing the changes in water supply with the changes in the water demand to see how water deficits may change in the future with and without climate change mitigation. So what we found here is this. So this is our result for the water deficit simulated by the model. This is just based on the base year 2005. A lot of these areas that are shown in red correspond to areas that have pretty large water deficit. And these are mostly areas where, for now, we are relying a lot on groundwater pumping to irrigate the crops. So then the point is, well, I mean, in reality, of course, we can continue to pump groundwater and there would be no water deficit. But in reality, the groundwater can't really be pumped forever. So this should really be counted as water deficit here. And then when we compare like in the future years, like 2020, 2050, and 2080s. And so this is for RCP 4.5 with the climate change mitigation. And this is for RCP 8.5 without climate change mitigation. Surprisingly, we find that with climate change mitigation, this reddish yellow color means the water deficit actually get worse. And well, in both scenarios, water deficits get worse in the future, which is why people say in the future, water is gold, because we really wouldn't have enough water in a lot of areas around the world. But surprisingly, what we found is that in the climate change mitigation scenario, the water deficits are actually worse than without climate change mitigation. So we wanted to investigate a little bit like why that would be the case. And so we did an analysis looking at these so-called water deficit hotspots in the future. And we have a definition of what we mean by water deficit hotspot. So it has to have a minimum of 4 adjacent grid cells exceeding certain threshold to be called an 85 percentile to be called a deficit. And so when we compare 4.5, which is shown in the purple color, with 8.5, which is the green color, we indeed see that this is the cumulative PDF of water deficit. And so we indeed see that 4.5 is worse than 8.5. So now when we look at both water supply and demand, we wanted to know, is water supply driving this change or water demand driving this change? And so here we show again purple color in 4.5 and green in 8.5, but we use the open circle for water demand changes and then the solid circle for water supply. What we found is that if you compare the purple versus the green in terms of solid circle, which is the supply, you do see that actually the water supply coming from 4.5 is indeed better. So it means that by doing the climate change mitigation, you reduce the warming, and by reducing the warming, you do indeed cut down on the evapotranspiration. So there is indeed more water supply in the streams to provide for water in the future. However, when you look at the change in the water demand, which is the open circle, comparing the two colors, you see that the water demand in the climate change mitigation scenario is a lot more. And that actually overwhelms the benefits of the changes in the water supply. And so the question is, why would RCP 4.5 increase the water demand so much? In fact, what it is that most of the climate change mitigation scenario really rely, in order to cut down on emission in the future, what they do is to grow a lot of bioenergy crop so that they don't have to rely so much on fossil energy in the future. But by growing bioenergy crops, in a lot of areas, you rely on irrigation to grow the crop, and that significantly changed the water demand, so much that the change in the water demand overcomes the benefits of the reduced warming that provide a little bit more water supply in the future. So this is essentially what we found. And then we asked the question, because we have actually seen a few previous studies kind of ask a similar question before, and they came to very different answers. Some studies said that mitigation is good for water deficit, and some studies say that mitigation is bad for water deficit. We wanted to understand why our results seems to show very clearly, quite robustly, that climate change mitigation is bad for water deficit. So we kind of reduced the resolution of our model, because previous studies mostly they were done either at kind of like annual time scale, and also spatially pretty coarse resolution, like half a degree, compared to our study, which is done at the daily time scale and 1/8 degree resolution. What we found is that as we reduce the temporal and the spatial resolution from this color to kind of like pinkish color, the signal, which is defined as the difference between the two scenarios, first of all, significantly reduces. But there is almost very little or no reduction in the interannual variability. So in that sense, the signal-to-noise ratio is significantly reduced as you go to much coarser resolution, both temporally and spatially, meaning that the difference between the two scenarios becomes almost like negligible, which is probably one of the reasons why previous studies, some show positive and some show negative effect, whereas our study, by going to much higher resolution, we were able to actually show pretty clear bad effects coming from climate change mitigation on water deficit. So just a very quick summary. So we have developed this modeling framework that allows us to look at the nexus in energy, water, and land. And so we were able to compare these kind of impacts of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And I show you the results evaluating our model in the drought case for 2012, and then we compare the two scenarios and show that if climate change mitigation has to be achieved by growing more bioenergy crop, it actually doesn't help at all in terms of water deficit in the future. So I'm going to end it soon, but before that, I'm just going to show you a little bit of ongoing work that we are now extending the modeling framework. So the Mozart modeling framework used to only simulate the water, the stream amount of water or the stream flow in the rivers, but we have extended the framework now to also simulate stream temperature. So this is a comparison of the simulated and the observed stream temperature over the US. And we are now also extending the modeling framework to simulate flooding or inundation in the rivers. Also, ongoing work in adding the next step in the river biogeochemistry. So we have started adding carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycle, as well as sediment being transported in the rivers. So these are important processes that actually transport these kind of things into the ocean and would have pretty important effects on the coastal biogeochemistry. And lastly, in terms of water management, we have now started to apply our water management model globally but globally it's actually pretty difficult to do a good job because we have not a lot of information in terms of how the reservoirs are being managed and how far they draw down on the reservoir and things like that. But we were able to now make use of satellite data, combining two kinds of data, altimetry data that give us the water level in the reservoirs, and using the MODIS data to give us the surface area of the reservoir. Combining that, we were able to use that information to constrain the model in terms of how far down we draw on the reservoir to give us a more reasonable simulation globally. And I'm going to skip that, so just have some acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruby. Any questions for Ruby's talk?
You have too much money.
Yes,
Seriously, very interesting now. I think if you're really interested in a fun project, one thing you personally can give you more information. China is starting a huge project because of drought in the north, more water in the south.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
南水北调. Okay.
Yeah, the diversion, water diversion.
Yeah. So that would be a huge impact.
Yes.
You certainly can do a fun project by running your model to look at
Right.
different aspect of it.
Yeah, especially when, especially looking at these energy water food nexus, I think is really an important thing to do, because when we talk about like mitigating climate change in the future, I mean, you really have to look at the whole picture altogether, right? You cannot just mitigate one thing and then what about the other part of the story? And I think this is, yeah.
Can you put a uncertainty bar on this?
I'm sorry?
Uncertainty bar.
Uncertainty bar. Yes, well, as you can see, I mean, for now, the study that I talk about, I mean, we only use a single GCM and a single regional model, right? Although I have actually compared the CSM simulation and the WRF CLM simulation with the whole CMIP5 ensemble. In fact, I find that there are quite a lot of robust changes in precipitation and evapotranspiration across the models that actually show up in some of the robustness of our results. I don't have an error bar or uncertainty bar, but I think that actually even with just using a single model, in fact, we were capturing quite a bit of the robust changes in P minus E.
I've already asked lots of questions, but I'm interested also in how the water availability might change if you were to make an assumption of a different scenario. So, for example, instead of bioenergy, if you went photovoltaics for energy production.
Yeah, I think that would be an important thing to do. But for now, because actually the 4.5 scenario, I mean, if you look across all the 4.5 scenarios, the way they achieve climate change mitigation, they are all by using bioenergy crop. Which means actually it's not reasonable. If indeed this would cause such a water deficit problem, then we should really consider some other scenarios that might be more feasible. Yeah.
JP?
Ruby, it's a very interesting talk.
Yeah.
I like your treatment of very detailed stream flow and even reservoirs. Then I'm wondering, have you considered the natural reservoir, the small lakes? Have you treated that?
Oh yes, in fact we can treat that. First of all, the CLM model does have a lake model, and we can use that lake model either as a man-made reservoir or as a natural reservoir, and it can so we can also extend that to simulate the thermodynamics as well. Yeah.
And Zhongliang?
Maybe you skip one slide. Can you show that?
Which one?
The second to the last slide.
Yeah. Which one?
Next one.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah, I didn't talk about this. This one is essentially what I'm trying to say is that when we manage the water, right? I mean, so there's a lot of groundwater use in the U.S. as well as in some other countries like India. But when you pump the groundwater, you actually apply it back for irrigation. And then the excess water actually, it goes back to the river as return flow. So those kind of processes really need to be represented, because otherwise you would be exaggerating some of the water deficit. And so we have now begun to actually incorporate this return flow into our module. And we find that in some area, it can significantly change the regional distribution of water because of the return flow. Yeah.
Thanks, Ruby.